Tractate Megillah is the tractate which deals with the laws of the reading of the Megillah and the holiday of Purim, among other topics. The Megillah, or the Book of Esther, recounts the story of how a man named Haman attempted to destroy the Jewish people during the reign of the Persian king Ahasuerus between the times of the First and Second Temple, and with God's help was thwarted by Esther and Mordechai. So, the first Mishnah. The Megillah scroll can sometimes be read on the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, or 15th of the month of Adar, no earlier and no later. It's read on the 15th in cities that were walled by the times of Yehoshua bin Nun. Other cities read it on the 14th, and sometimes by smaller villages earlier on days of assembly on Mondays and Thursdays. So if the 14th of Adar falls out on a Monday, great, the small cities read the Megillah then, the big cities the following day. If the 14th falls out on a Tuesday, small villages will read the Megillah on Monday, other cities on Tuesday, and cities that were walled by the times of Yehoshua on Wednesday. The same applies on Wednesdays and Fridays. If the 14th falls out on Shabbos, villages and other cities read the Megillah on Thursday, and the walled cities on Sunday. If the 14th falls out on Sunday, the small villages read it on Thursday, the other cities read it on Sunday, and the walled cities on the 15th, on Monday. The Gemara explains the leniency by small villages to do the Megillah reading earlier is so that on the day of Purim they'll be able to give food to the other towns for the Purim feasts. It also brings the verses that allude to these dates and verses which limit it to those. These specific verses are discussed or argued over. We also bring a verse that alludes to cities that were walled by Yeshua, as it says in the Megillah, "Therefore the Jews of unwalled places who dwell in unwalled cities celebrate Purim on the 14th, implying if it was walled, it's on the 15th, as was celebrated in the city of Shushan, the capital city of Persia. We also know we commemorate Purim with the reading of the Megillah on the same day the holiday is celebrated, as it says, "These days shall be commemorated and celebrated," juxtaposing them. Others have the opinion that it goes by cities that were walled by the times of Ahasuerus, not Yehoshua, as it's like the same way the city of Shushan was walled at that time. The opinion that it's walled cities from the earlier time of Yehoshua bin Nun is based off of verse linkage of specific words, and Shushan has a special status that they celebrate Purim on the 15th because that's where the actual miracle happened. The other opinion is also discussed. It also mentions the concept that there are certain Hebrew letters which, if put at the end of a word, are drawn slightly differently, which was a concept instituted by the prophets. They had existed by Moshe, as was referenced with a miracle by the tablets of the Ten Commandments, that the final letter of Mem and also Samach, which have a hole in the middle, were carved all the way through, and the middle bit just stayed in place as a miracle. So, the prophets just instituted the proper usage of these letters specifically at the end of a word. It also lists who wrote the Aramaic translation, the Targum, of many books of scripture, Onkelos of the Torah, which actually had existed earlier but was forgotten. Yonasan ben Uziel wrote on the Book of Prophets, and when that happened the land of Israel shook, and a heavenly voice asked how he could be revealing the secrets to mortals. So he answered that he only did it for God's glory, so it was fine. But he wasn't allowed to write such a text on the books of writings, as they contain allusion as to the coming of Mashiach. Israel didn't shake during the writing of the Targum on the Torah, as the Torah is very clear, and it's more the books of prophets that have enigmatic subjects. It gives some examples of this. It says that I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, and the people who were with me did not see the vision, yet a great fear fell upon them, and they fled into hiding. It said that the people with Daniel were the greater prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, although less great in that they didn't see the vision. It also says that although they didn't see the vision, they fled in fear as their representative angel saw it. And it says that based on this, if you randomly become frightened, it's because your mazel saw something. If this happens, you should say the Shema prayer. If you can't, as you're in a dirty place, for instance, you should jump 4 cubits to the side. And if you can't do that, say, the goat at the slaughterhouse is fatter than me. Anyways, back to the hearing of the Megillah on Purim. Kohanim and Leviim must abandon their post at the sacrificial services in the temple to hear it, as must people who are studying Torah. It also gets into a related point about Yehoshua meeting an angel, which proves that Torah study is more important than offering temple sacrifices. It also says that Yehoshua greeted the angel with the word shalom, as he knew it wasn't a demon, where saying such a thing is not allowed, as the angel said, "I am an officer in the army of God." And there's a tradition that demons don't say the name of God in vain. You have to interrupt studying the Torah for the Purim Megillah, but don't interrupt while you're honoring the Torah by mourning the death of a Torah scholar. Burying an unattended corpse also supersedes hearing the Megillah being read. There are more points on cities and villages. For instance, a city that was built but only later had a wall built around it, that's still considered to only be a village. Also, a city without 10 men from that city who are constantly in the synagogue is regarded only as a village. A city that was destroyed and then resettled is regarded as a city. Here, a city being destroyed means that the 10 men in the synagogue ceases and then later come back. It lists some cities that were walled during the time of Yeshua, cities like Lud, Gei HaCherashim, and others, along with a bit of their history. Also, women are obligated to hear the Megillah, as they were also involved in the miracle of Purim. Another teaching, if Purim falls out on a Shabbos, meaning the Megillah is read earlier, we still teach about Purim on the Shabbos, which is also done by all holidays. It's just specified to say it's allowed, and there's no concern here about somebody carrying a Megillah over on Shabbos. Also, we read the Megillah on the night and the day of Purim, based on a few sources. As we said, small villages can have their Megillah reading on Mondays and Thursdays to allow them to give food to their neighbors on this day. This won't apply if the villagers don't actually gather on Mondays or Thursdays, or when the day falls out on a Monday or Thursday. It's not pushed off any further, as this leniency only applies when it benefits the residents. It also gets into some unique phrasing in the Mishnah where it lists dates in a specific order to avoid confusion. There's further discussion on this dates and the differences between walled cities, regular cities, and villages. In addition to the listed reasons we don't read Megillah on Shabbos, it's also not done as the poor receive gifts normally afterwards, which is brought from a source. Also, if you read the Megillah on an earlier date, you'd also give gifts to the poor on that earlier date, but the Purim feast would still be done at its proper time on the 14th. There's argument that you need a gathering of 10 men to read the Megillah before, and if this applies, if it's not at the proper time. We seem to rule that it's not required. New Mishnah. What constitutes a large town? If there are 10 men who are unemployed, so that they can always be present at the synagogue during prayer. If there is less, it's only considered a village. By the Megillah reading, we could do it at an earlier date, but we don't postpone it to a later date. This is unlike the wood offering of the Kohanim, the fast of Tisha B'Av, the holiday Chagiga offering, and the Hakel assembly, which can be postponed but not done earlier. If the Megillah is read on an earlier date, you can also eulogize, fast, and give the gifts to the poor on this date. You can only make the reading earlier if the villagers gather on Mondays and Thursdays, otherwise not. The Gemara brings sources for many of these points. We don't do the fast of Tisha B'Av early, as it's the commemoration of a calamity, which isn't advanced. The holiday Chagiga offering and the Hakel assembly aren't done early, as they have a set time for their obligation, so doing it before that time doesn't really accomplish anything. We bring sources more on the Chagiga offering, and the remaining points are discussed. Therefore, the points on this, and whether the city of Tiberias is considered a walled city and other cities, and how their laws relate to other concepts. It gives the definition of many more cities and why they're called by their names. There's more on this, discussing many other cities from the Torah and what their modern equivalent is, and details about them. For instance, it says that both Caesarea and Jerusalem will never be settled or destroyed at the same time, only one or the other, and other similar verses and points. It also references a location known as Germania and their interactions with the Romans, which is interpreted by many to be Germany, and says that if they go forth, they would destroy the world. Another teaching, if somebody says, I tried but did not succeed, don't believe him. If he says, I did not try and succeeded, don't believe him. If somebody says, I tried and succeeded, you may believe him. It clarifies this applies to Torah study. With business, that's dependent on God's assistance, and it's even dependent on God's assistance to retain your Torah knowledge. In addition, based off of verses, it says not to antagonize a wicked person who is enjoying good fortune. His endeavors will be successful, he will win in court, and he will witness the downfall of his enemies. This applies to personal affairs. With heavenly affairs, meaning to defend Torah and mitzvahs, then you should get involved. Some say it's only allowed to get involved if you're truly righteous. Some only don't allow it if the wicked individual is having good fortune. It also speaks of Italia, of Yavon, the great city of Rome, and speaks of its great size, markets, architecture, and geography. New Mishnah. If the Megillah is read on the first Adar, and afterwards is decided to make the year a leap year, meaning now it has 2 Adars, you have to reread the Megillah during the second Adar. In addition, the only obligations that you must do in the second Adar are of reading the Megillah and giving gifts to the poor. The Gemara says that this implies that it's permissible to read the 4 special Torah portions of Adar in the first month, but it's debated. It's held that they must be done in the second month of Adar. The sources are also discussed. There are further points on this and on the institution of this holiday. For instance, some say it was originally instituted only in the city of Shushan and then later everywhere, and also some teach that Esther requested that this holiday be created and the sages said no, as then the nations might get upset thinking we're celebrating their downfall. But Esther said everything's already written in the history books, so it should be done. And there are other points, such as that the Megillah scroll doesn't make your hands impure, as while it was composed with the divine spirit, it was written for the purpose of reading, not fit for the purpose of being written as a part of scripture. There are sources. We said that we bring gifts to the poor on Purim. This means 2 gifts, 1 gift for each of 2 people. There are some stories about sages giving gifts to each other. It also famously says, as the sage Rava taught, that on Purim you're obligated to become so intoxicated that you can't tell the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Also, another famous incident that's subject to a lot of discussion. The sages Rabbah and Reb Zera were once eating their Purim feast together. They got drunk and Rabbah slew Reb Zera. Rabbah then prayed and Reb Zera was revived. The next year Rabbah asked him to have another Purim feast and Reb Zera responded that not every time does a miracle occur. It also says that you have to have the Purim feast on the day of Purim, not by the night, and similar points on this. New Mishnah. By the way, at least for the rest of this chapter, while it does frequently discuss Purim in the Megillah, the actual Mishnahs being brought have little to do with the holiday of Purim, and are just being quoted as they have a similar phraseology to the last Mishnah. There is no difference between Shabbos and holidays except with regard to food preparation. The Gemara says, based on this, the laws of preliminaries to food preparation are the same. It's argued on based on verses, and an opinion holds that preliminaries on holidays are allowed if they could have been done prior. New Mishnah. There is no difference between penalties of desecrating Shabbos and Yom Kippur, except that for Shabbos, the punishments are given by the court, and by Yom Kippur, the punishment is kares, which is divine punishment from God. The Gemara explains that they have the same laws regarding a monetary obligation for repayment. We also bring sources. New Mishnah. There is no difference between someone who vows to not benefit from somebody and somebody who vows to not benefit with food from somebody, except in regards to entering his property and using utensils which aren't used for food. The Gemara clarifies that utensils which are used for food are forbidden for both. Entering somebody's property here is considered as a benefit, as this is like the opinion that included in such a vow is things like gratuities. New Mishnah. There is no difference between vow offerings and gift offerings, except that by a vow offering you're responsible for the animal's security, unlike by a gift offering. The Gemara clarifies that they both have the same laws in regards to not delaying the bringing of these offerings. This is defined. New Mishnah. There is no difference between a zov, a concept in regards to laws of impurity, somebody who has a gonorrheal emission, whether it's 2 or 3, except in regards to the requirement to bring an offering. The Gemara clarifies other similar laws by such rules of impurity and their sources. They're discussed a bit further. New Mishnah. There is no difference between a mitzora, someone with tsaras, leprosy, whether he's confined because he's suspected of having this or he's been actually confirmed, except in regards to letting his hair grow and tearing his garments. Also, there is no difference between their respective purification besides for the requirements to shave their hair and the procedure with the birds. The Gemara again clarifies the laws that are similar, like sending them out of a city and all the laws of impurity. Again, sources are brought which are discussed. New Mishnah. There is no difference between the laws of scrolls of scripture and the laws of the scrolls in tefillin or mezuzahs, besides that scripture can be written in any language, while tefillin and mezuzahs must be written in Hebrew. Some said that the only other language that books of scripture can be written in is Greek. The Gemara clarifies similar laws about sewing both with sinew and laws of impurity. The point about writing in different languages is argued on. There's a lot of discussion on this, and also why only Greek in reference to the time that the Torah was translated, as a king Ptolemy of Egypt gathered 72 sages, put them in separate rooms, and told them all to translate the Torah into Greek, and every single one of them thought to make some small adjustments so the king wouldn't be offended by certain verses or similar, so they all made some slight spelling or grammatical adjustments in the Greek translations, and they all miraculously lined up perfectly. In the end, we ruled that the only language besides for Hebrew the Torah can be written in is this ancient classical Greek language. New Mishnah. There is no difference between a Kohen Gadol who is anointed with the anointing oil and a Kohen Gadol who dons the special vestments, except in regards to bringing a bull offering in case of a mistaken ruling. Also, there's no difference between a serving Kohen Gadol and a retired one, besides for the bull offering on Yom Kippur, and the 10th of an ephah pan offering. The Gemara lists similarities in the temple services of the Kohen Gadol, these statuses, and some additional debate. New Mishnah. There is no difference between an offering of a major communal, bama, an altar outside of the temple, when it's permissible, and a minor one for an individual, besides for the paschal offering, which can only be brought on a major one. General rule, any offering that is valid or donated can be brought on a minor bama, otherwise no. The Gemara says that included in those only allowed on a major bama are similar to the paschal offering, any obligated offering with a fixed date, and sources are brought. New Mishnah. There is no difference between the tabernacle at Shiloh and the temple in Jerusalem. Besides that, by the tabernacle you could eat offerings of lesser holiness and Meiser Sheni tithes within sight of the tabernacle. In Jerusalem you could only eat them within the walls of Jerusalem. Offerings of greater holiness both must be eaten within the curtains or walls of either structure. After the destruction of the Shiloh tabernacle, bamos, as mentioned, altars outside the temple, were permitted, but not so after the destruction of the temple. The Gemara says that one opinion held it was allowed to make offerings at one other temple after the temple was destroyed, but he was disproven, so he retracted his opinion. There's argument in regards to the temple's sanctity after its destruction, which goes on for a bit. There's a bit more, and now this tractate is going to go through basically the entire text of the Megillah with little teachings and traditions on basically every verse and section in regards to the story of Purim. Again, as a very brief summary of the story, the Jewish people were in exile in Persia. The king Achashverosh was advised by his minister Haman to destroy all the Jewish people. Achashverosh, after drunkenly ordering his first wife, Vashti, the descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, to be executed, held a beauty contest of a sort for a new wife, and wound up marrying Esther, or Hadassah, a relative of the sage and leader of the Jewish people of that time, Mordechai, who advised Esther to hide her religion, and together worked with God's help to foil Haman's plot. Haman was eventually hung on the gallows that he had built to hang Mordechai. Along with Haman's 10 sons, a great battle was fought in the capital city of Shushan. The Jewish people won, and it's now celebrated and commemorated as the holiday of Purim, which is recorded in the Book of Esther, or the Megillah, which there is an obligation to read on this day, hence this entire tractate. That's a very, very rough summary. There's a lot more details, but that's the short version. To begin with, the very first verse of the Megillah is, "And it was in the days of Achashverosh." It says, whenever it uses the phrase, "and it was," that connotes a negative time, and it gives many examples, along with a few other points on the importance of modesty. It also says the tradition that the ark didn't take up any physical room, miraculously, based on some measurements of its dimensions. Anyways, it lists a few verses that many sages said prior to giving lectures on the Megillah, which in their words reference many aspects of the story, such as the righteousness of Mordechai and Esther, the wickedness of Haman, and others. It also says that God does not rejoice in the downfall of the wicked, even by the drowning of the Egyptians in the Red Sea. He did not allow the angels to sing as his handiwork drowned. There are more introductory verses brought. There are more of these, among many points as to why the king Achashverosh is called Achashverosh, usually as it could be translated as an expression of suffering, literally woe upon his head, and similar. The Megillah then repeats, Achashverosh, that is Achashverosh. This is to teach that Achashverosh remained the same, wicked from beginning to end. There are similar phrases used for many figures in the Torah. It then says that he ruled. Some say this is positive, as he didn't inherit the throne. He seized it. Others say it's negative, as he basically bought it with a ton of money. It then says he ruled from Hodu until Cush. Some say this means that they were the opposite extents of his rule. Some say they're right next to each other, and it means that the same way he ruled over them, he ruled over the entire world. There's a similar phrasing brought from a different source. The Megillah says that he ruled 127 provinces. Some say that the unique phrasing implies that he ruled over 7 provinces, then 20 more, then 100 more. Similarly, there are 3 kings that have ruled over the entire world, Achav, Achashverosh, and Nebuchadnezzar, based off sources. Other kings are excluded from this list from individually unique reasons. It also says that Achashverosh had looked at the prophecies, as it said that the Jewish people would be in exile for 70 years, but he miscalculated and thought the period had passed without their exile ending, so celebrated with his feast and brought out all the stolen vessels and artifacts to be used at said banquet. The year calculation is given. There's a bit more on this. It says that Persia and Mede had a deal that if someone from one country was the king, the governors would be from the other country. Achashverosh wore the priestly garments of the Kohen Gadol at the feast. Some say Achashverosh was a wise king, as he invited outlanders to his feast first, as they'd be more difficult to appease. Others say he was foolish, as he should have invited residents of his own city first, as his own city could support him if the others rebelled. There's discussion on why the Jewish people of this period deserved destruction. Some say it was because they attended this feast, some say it was because they had bowed to the idol of Nebuchadnezzar, some say because they only pretended to bow, God only pretended to destroy the Jewish people. There are further definition and explanation of the feast, and its finery and food. The women's feast was right next door, as Achashverosh and his wife Vashti intended for everyone to commit immoral acts. On the 7th day of the feast, on a Shabbos, Achashverosh was drunk and discussed with others whose country had the most beautiful women. So they said he should prove his wife was the most beautiful by parading her out without any clothes on. It's explained that this was repayment for the fact that Vashti, his wife, had forced Jewish girls to work for her while undressed on Shabbos. Originally, Vashti, who was herself a very immoral woman, intended to go out, but she then refused. Some say that she broke out into leprosy. Some say the angel Gabriel came and made her grow a tail. She then mocked the king for becoming drunk off such little wine, unlike her father, Balthazar. It says that Achashverosh asked for a counsel as to what to do with his wife. Originally, he asked the Jewish sages, but this was not something that they wanted to get involved in, so they just said that ever since the destruction of the temple and the Jewish people's exile, they could no longer give counsel and pronounce capital punishment. Eventually, he asked one of his advisors, a man named Memuchan, who was explained to just be Haman, disrespectfully answering first, and advised that they should make a law that every man should rule in his house. This actually benefited the Jewish people, as it was such a ludicrous decree that future decrees, like for the destruction of the Jews, were not taken as seriously. Anyways, Vashti was put to death. Ahasuerus wanted a new wife, so he was advised to gather all the young women from the land and pick one. It says that people ended up hiding their daughters. It then mentions Mordechai, who explains some points on his lineage. It also explains some of the other names of Moshe. Mordechai went into exile of his own will, and had raised his adoptive daughter, his younger cousin, after her parents died, whose name was Hadassah. She was called Esther, which means to conceal, as she hid the fact that she was Jewish, but in Aramaic it means moon, as she was said to be as beautiful as the moon by everybody else. The name Hadassah means myrtle, which the righteous are compared to. Some say her name was Myrtle, some say because she was of average height, like a myrtle, some say because she had greenish complexion, like a myrtle, but she still appeared beautiful. Some don't translate the word daughter as meaning daughter, some say it means home, meaning that they were actually married. Anyways, she was brought to the king's palace and had 7 maids, one for each day of the week, so she could keep track of which day was Shabbos. Haggai, the custodian of the woman, some say he arranged for her to get kosher food, some say he had her eat pig meat, which was a delicacy, some say he gave her seeds. Those were the points on her preparation before going to the king. Ahasuerus would take one of the women to be with him every night, and it said that as heinous as this was, at least he had the decency to not have relations during the day. It further describes Esther's great beauty, how Ahasuerus fell for her, and that he tried to convince her to reveal her origins by making a feast in her name, remitting taxes, and similar. It also said that all the women were regathered a second time. It's explained that Ahasuerus asked Mordechai how to convince his wife to reveal his origins, so Mordechai advised him to regather all the original women to make her jealous, and it's explained that he did this in hopes of making him pick somebody else. There are more points on the different merits of several figures, that they merited to have certain people descend from them. There are some further points on Esther and Ahasuerus. It then says, in the meanwhile, these 2 men, Bigsan and Seresh, became angry and wanted to assassinate Ahasuerus. They plotted to poison him in their native language of Tarzian, but Mordechai was sitting nearby, and Mordechai was one of the Sanhedrin and spoke basically every single language. Anyways, Mordechai reported this attempted assassination to Queen Esther, who reported it to Ahasuerus, so the would-be assassins were dealt with, and Mordechai's assistance was recorded in the Book of Chronicles. Anyways, this happened first, as God only creates an affliction after creating the remedy. So then Haman came into power and made a law that everybody had to bow down to him. Mordechai, of course, refused, so Haman got really mad at him, and that hatred slowly expanded to the rabbis, and then got to the Jewish people. So he decided to make a lottery on which day to destroy the Jewish people. It landed on the Hebrew month of Adar, which Haman was thrilled about, as that's the month when Moshe passed away, although he didn't realize that Moshe had also been born on the same day, on the 7th of Adar. It then explains how Haman slyly and skillfully convinced Ahasuerus to give him permission to destroy the Jews. He bribed Ahasuerus with shkalim, many silver coins, which God always knew would happen, hence the institution of the half-shekel fund towards the temple. Ahasuerus removed his signet ring and gave it to Haman to do it with whatever he wanted. This was said to be a greater action than every single prophet and prophetess, as it was this action that got the Jewish people to repent and turn to righteousness. We don't see the Hallel prayer in Purim, as the miracle happened outside of Israel. Passover has Hallel, though, as that happened before they got to Israel in the first place. Some say it's because reading the Megillah is equivalent to saying Hallel. There's more discussion on this in the prophets. It also lists the 7 prophetesses: Sarah, Miriam, Devorah, Hannah, Abigail, Huldah, and Esther. It goes through their prophecies. Miriam prophesies the birth of Moshe, for instance, and all of the others. The prophetesses are discussed a bit further. There's also discussion as to who the figure of Malachi was. Some say it was actually Mordechai, some say it was Ezra. It also says that there were 4 women of exceptional beauty in the world: Sarah, Abigail, Rachav, and Esther. According to the opinion that Esther was green, they would replace her with Vashti, and there's points on the beauty of these women, particularly Rachav. There are more points. Some say that the officer Hasach was actually Daniel. Anyways, Esther requested of Mordechai to have all the Jewish people fast and pray, as she herself did before approaching the king and asking for his assistance. Also, as now she'd be approaching the king with consent, as opposed to all the previous times, according to the opinion that she was actually Mordechai's wife, this would mean that they could never be together again. Mordechai made a fast on Passover, and it says that Esther clothed herself in royalty, a reference to the divine spirit. A few miscellaneous teachings: never ignore the blessing or curse of even an ordinary person based on a few verses, and it says how God is unlike a mortal, that a man places a pot and then fills it with water, while God places water and then surrounds it with a pot. There are further teachings. There are some other points on God judging the world. Anyways, Esther approached the king. It says 3 angels came. 1 raised her neck, 1 endowed her with charm, and 1 stretched the king's scepter towards her. Some say the scepter was originally 2 cubits and it became 12. Some say 16, some say 24, as was done by the arm of the daughter of Pharaoh when she reached out to grab Moshe's basket. Achashverosh offered Esther anything, even half his kingdom. This is explained to be anything, but not the full kingdom, and not something that divides the kingdom, being the building of the temple. Esther instead asked Achashverosh and Haman to join her at a feast. There are many reasons. Some say she invited Haman so he wouldn't suspect her of being a Jew. Some say she did this so that the Jewish people wouldn't think she's Jewish and would stop praying. Some say it was so that if she convinced Achashverosh to execute Haman, it would be done immediately without time for anybody to change their mind. Some say it was to make the king jealous, and others. Haman had 10 sons, but some say he had much more. It was just 10 that were hanged, and the rest died or became beggars. That night, it says the king could not sleep. Some say this is a reference to God. Some say this was Achashverosh, who was worried that his wife and Haman were conspiring against him, so he wanted to see if there was anybody that had helped him that he had yet to reward. So he had the Book of Chronicles read to him. Some say, based on the wording, that the Book of Chronicles miraculously kept flipping to the page with Mordecai and read themselves. Some add that the king's scribe, Shimshai, was also a son of Haman, and he kept erasing the account of Mordecai saving the king's life, and the angel Gabriel kept on rewriting it. There are more points. It says that Haman had prepared a massively tall gallows to hang him, Mordecai, although in the end it was himself that was hung. Haman showed up then, and Achashverosh asked him what he should do to a man the king wished to reward. Haman, thinking he was referring to himself, said he should wear the king's clothes and crown, and be paraded around the city on the king's horse, while someone cries, "Thus shall be done to the man whom the king wishes to honor." Achashverosh then said to do just that to Mordecai the Jew who sits by the gate, to be very specific so Haman couldn't pick someone else. Haman then went to Mordecai, who was teaching a class on the laws of Kmitza, the flour offering, so Mordecai told everybody to get out of there as he was suspecting that Haman was coming to kill him, and then began to pray. When he was done, Haman told him that your fistful of flour has pushed away my 10,000 silver talents. So Mordecai said it doesn't really matter, as you're legally my slave, due to a way earlier incident, a long time earlier, where Haman had once sold himself as a slave to Mordecai for some bread. So technically all of Haman's property belonged to him anyways. Haman told Mordecai to wear the king's clothes, but Mordecai said, "Not until I get a haircut," and Esther, in the meanwhile, had detained all of the bathhouse attendants and barbers in the entire city, so Haman was forced to give the haircut himself. Haman began whining that he had fallen so far, and Mordecai reminded him that he had once started out as a village barber anyway. Then Haman told him he had to get on the horse, but Mordecai said he couldn't as he was tired from fasting, so Haman was forced to kneel and have Mordecai step up on him to reach the horse, and Mordecai made sure to kick him on the way up. As they were traveling and Haman was leading Mordecai through the city, Haman's daughter saw the procession and assumed that it was Mordecai leading Haman on the horse, so she emptied a chamber pot out of her window onto the head of the man leading the horse, and when she saw it was her father, she threw herself off the roof and died. Haman then sought advice from his friends, who it calls wise, as anybody, Jew or non-Jew, can be called wise if they speak with wisdom. They said that the Jewish people were compared to the dust and stars, that when they descend to the dust, but when they rise to the stars. Haman came to the second feast with Esther. Achashverosh asked Esther what was up. She revealed that she was Jewish and from the royal house of Saul, at which point he finally started speaking to her in person and accused Haman of everything, although it says she actually pointed at Achashverosh and an angel turned her hand towards Haman. Achashverosh stormed out to calm down. It says angels appeared as workers tearing apart the garden, and said they were doing so under the orders of Haman. Haman then begged Queen Esther for mercy and fell on her. It says an angel made him fall on her, so it looked like he was assaulting her, and Ahasuerus walked in just then and was really upset now. Charvaina, one of the counselors, had been on Haman's side, but he switched sides right here when he saw things were going poorly and thought this would be a pretty good time to inform the king that Haman had built a massive gallows for Mordecai, so Ahasuerus ordered Haman to be hanged on it instead, and it says the king's anger was abated, both God's and Ahasuerus's. There are other points. It also explains that Yosef fell on his brother Binyamin's neck and wept. Neck is plural in reference to him weeping for both temples, which were built in Binyamin's territory and were destroyed. There are some additional points on Yosef, meeting his brothers. It also says in the Megillah that the Jews had light, being Torah, gladness, being holiday, joy, being circumcision, and honor, being tefillin. The 10 sons of Haman are also listed, and as they all died at the same moment, when you read the Megillah, you should read them all in one breath. The letter Vav in the last name, Vayizasa, is elongated, as they were all hung on one pole. It also gets into some points on the structure of the spacing of verses in Scripture when it's a song being recited. There are further points listing how the Jewish people then fought in the city of Shushan against everybody who wanted to kill them. They won, and now the Megillah is read from a scroll. It also says that some members of the Sanhedrin lowered Mordechai's position after all of this, as he chose to maintain his political position to keep the Jewish people safe over going back to learning Torah. There are further points about the great importance of learning Torah. There are some other calculations on the life of Yaakov and the schools he studied in, and some other points on his life. And that's the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Tractate Megillah goes through further laws on the reading of the Megillah scroll on the holiday of Purim. The first Mishnah begins by saying, if you say it out of order, or by heart, or in any language other than Hebrew, it's not a valid reading. But if you read it in a different language for somebody who speaks that language, it's valid, as is somebody who doesn't understand Hebrew but reads the Megillah in Hebrew. If you read the Megillah in segments or while half asleep, it's valid. It's also valid if you coincidentally read the Megillah while writing, expounding on, or correcting a Megillah, and you just end up reading every word, as long as you have the proper intent. It lists many forbidden inks. It must be in Hebrew on parchment with black ink. The Gemara brings sources for all these points. The sources are disputed by several opinions. It also gets into a side point on the Shemona Esrei prayer, the Amidah, and the verse sources for their order, and some further explanation. There's a lot more on the explanation behind the order and sequence of many prayers. When we said that the Megillah could be read in other languages, that meant only in Greek. It lists other languages that you can't read the Megillah in. It also lists a few odd words in 4 languages that were difficult to define and their meaning in context. In regards to pausing in the middle of the Megillah, some say it's invalid if you wait the amount of time it takes to read the Megillah, others disagree. There are points on how many letters from a Megillah can be missing for it to be invalid. It gives definition as to what half asleep means, and when he's reading the Megillah while writing it, he's reading from a full Megillah while simultaneously copying it down. This is argued on. The other types of inks are also defined. New Mishnah. If someone from a town went into a large city, or vice versa, if you plan on returning to your original location, you read the Megillah on the day of your original place of residence. If not, you read Megillah according to where you are now. Some say you're required to read the entire Megillah. Some say just from the verse Ish Yehudi. Some say from the verse Achar Hadvarim Ha'ela. The Gemara says, somebody who won't be returning to his original town before the night of the 14th of Adar, he reads Megillah according to where he is now. Sources are brought. There are similar points and verses discussed, along with on some further points on the Megillah, how Mordechai refused to bow to Haman, as he had effectively made himself an idol, so the miracle occurred, and similar. We follow the rule that you must read the entire Megillah. There's also some quick points on the stitching of the Megillah scroll. There are also some additional points on the formatting of the writing of the Megillah and others. New Mishnah. Anybody is qualified to read a Megillah, besides for a deaf person, an insane individual, or a minor. Some allow a minor. Sources and explanation for all this is brought. The point on if a minor can read the Megillah is debated. New Mishnah. Until the sun rises, you may not read the Megillah. You also may not circumcise, immerse in mikvah for laws of impurity, or similar sprinkling with water after impurity. If any of this is done after the first ray of sunlight, it's still valid. The Gemara brings sources. The timing discussion is spoken about further. The sources and definitions of what constitutes dawn are brought. New Mishnah. You can read Megillah all day, as can you say Hallel, blow the shofar, shake the lulav, say the additional Musaf prayer, offer the Musaf sacrifice in the temple, or the confession with the bull offering, Ma'aser, or Yom Kippur. You can similarly slaughter sacrifices in the temple all day, do the waving of the sacrifices, and many other temple-related sacrifice actions during this time. You can reap the Omer offering all night, and burn sacrificial fat and limbs in the temple. Generally, a mitzvah that must be done through the day can be done all day, and if it must be done at night, it can be done all night. The Gemara brings sources for all these concepts and their proper timings. The general rule, we said, that the mitzvah should be done by day is to include the setting and removing of the spoons by the temple showbread. By doing a mitzvah at night, it's to include the eating of the paschal offering. And that's the end of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Tractate Megillah, again further going through the laws of the reading of the Megillah on Purim, begins with another Mishnah of this topic, although this chapter also discusses the laws of calling people up to the reading from the Torah. You can read the Megillah sitting or standing. You can have one person read it, or two simultaneously, and if your place's custom is to say a blessing, you say one, and if not, you don't need to. Generally, on Mondays, Thursdays, and Shabbos afternoons, we call 3 people up to read from the Torah during prayer, no more and no less. And we don't read a Haftorah, the ending portion from the Book of Prophets. They say blessings before and after. On Rosh Chodesh, the first day of a month, or Chol HaMoed, the intermediate days of certain holidays, the same rules apply, only we call 4 people up. On holidays, we call up 5. On Yom Kippur, 6, and on Shabbos, we call up 7 people to read from the Torah, no less, but we may do more. We finish by reading a Haftorah, a portion from the Book of Prophets, and we say blessings before and after. The Gemara says that by the reading of the Torah, you have to stand. Sources are brought. Similarly, you can't have 2 people reading the Torah simultaneously, but by Megillah and the Hallel prayer you can, as those prayers are beloved, so people will focus on them. The blessings on Megillah are listed. We said on Mondays, Thursdays, and Shabbos afternoons during prayer, 3 people are called up to the Torah. Some say this corresponds to the Torah, prophets, and writings. Some say to the Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael, and there are similar points discussed. This goes on for a bit. There's also debate as to how many people are called up to read from the Torah on a fast day, and there's discussion on the blessings that are said. There's more discussion. It mentions an incident that the sage Rav didn't fall to his face during the Tachanun repentance prayer, as it was a stone floor, which is problematic. It's discussed. Also, in regards to bowing, there was this special form of bowing called kiddah, where you stand straight and bow your face straight, folded to the ground, using only your thumbs to support yourself. The sage Levi tried to demonstrate this once, and he injured himself and became lame. The remaining holidays are also discussed with similar points, and as to whether the Maftir Torah portion counts as one of the 7 read, which is debated. It's discussed. New Mishnah. There are many specific blessings and prayers that are only done before a minyan, a group of 10 adult men. Dividing the Shema, doing the repetition of the Amidah, the Kohanim giving the priestly blessing, reading the Torah or the Haftorah, making funeral tributes, standing or sitting, the mourner's blessing or the mourner's consolation, the wedding blessing, or saying God's name in the Zimun blessing after eating a meal. For the appraising of consecrated land or worth of a person, you would also need 10 men, one of which must be a Kohen. The Gemara brings sources, and all of these points are discussed. Obviously, you can't consecrate yourself like that. What it means is you're donating your worth, which is appraised to be the value you'd theoretically be sold as a slave for. New Mishnah. Someone who reads from the Torah may not read less than 3 verses. If there's a translator, he shouldn't read more than a verse at a time, otherwise the translator can get confused. With books of prophets, you can read 3 verses at a time. If they're from 3 separate paragraphs, those must be read one at a time. You can skip between sections when reading from prophets, but not from the Torah. The most you can skip by prophets is the amount of time that the translator would have to pause for. The Gemara discusses sources, and there's more points on the reading of the books of prophets. New Mishnah. The one who reads the Haftarah, the portion from the Book of Prophets, is the one who divides the Shema, does the repetition of the Amidah, and if he's a Kohen, gives the priestly blessing. If he's a minor, his father or teacher do it instead. A minor can read or translate the Torah, but may not do any of the above listed things. Someone who's not properly clothed, he's allowed to divide the Shema or translate, but he can't read from the Torah, do the repetition of the Amidah, or give the priestly blessing. Blind men can translate, and there's a debate if you can divide the Shema, as some require you to have at some point seen the luminaries, as it's included in the blessing. The Gemara says that the Haftorah leader gets to lead all of the other services. Some say as an honor as he reads the Haftorah, some say to prevent argument. This is discussed further. It also says that similar laws about needing to be properly clothed when you read from the Torah don't just apply to adults, they apply to minors also. We rule that a blind person can divide the Shema as he can benefit from light. New Mishnah. A Kohen whose hands are blemished cannot raise his hands to give the priestly blessing. Some even prevent it if his hands are stained with dye, as it could be distracting. The Gemara lists a long list of deformities of the hands that disqualify you, and there are similar points discussed. New Mishnah. Someone who refuses to lead the prayer while wearing colored clothing or with sandals is not allowed to go up at all. Also, if you make your tefillin on your head round instead of square, they're actually kind of dangerous. If you bump your head into a wall with them, you could hurt yourself severely, and of course, they accomplish nothing. If the tefillin are at your forehead or palm instead of at your hairline and bicep, this was actually a heretical practice and not allowed. It's also wrong to coat your tefillin in gold or to wear them over your sleeve. The Gemara explains the first rulings that you can't specify to not wear colored clothes or sandals, as then we suspect he's getting some strange heretical ideas. We bring sources for the fact that tefillin must be square only. New Mishnah. There are many forms of blessings listed that you can't say. Someone who tries to interpret forbidden forms of intimacy as metaphorical as opposed to literal, that's forbidden. Someone who interprets the verse to not give your children over to the idol Moloch as meaning you cannot marry an Aramean woman is condemned. The Gemara goes through the forbidden blessings and explains why they're forbidden. Things like the grammar implies you're blessing two people or similar. This is largely a repeat of a discussion in Tractate Brachos 33b on ways we don't say blessings, like not with too much redundant adjectives, not repeating certain words that imply you're speaking to two people, and similar. The other points are discussed. New Mishnah. When, in the Torah, you read the episode with Reuven and his parents' beds, we read, but don't translate it as it's very frequently misunderstood. We do read and translate the incident with Tamar and the golden calf, but not the second repetition of those events. There's argument if the verses about the Merkava are read as a Haftorah, and the verses made known to Jerusalem. Some say we don't read that one either. The Gemara goes through all of these and others as to why they are or are not read. We also read but don't translate the priestly blessing. It also says an opinion that indefinite verses from the Torah should be read delicately. It also says that all mockery is forbidden, besides for the mockery of idolatry, and further points, such as that you're allowed to tell an idolater to take his idol and place it up his... And that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Tractate Megillah largely discusses the laws of the holiness of the synagogue, Torah scrolls, and similar. The first Mishnah states, if a town sells their town square, they can use the proceeds to buy a synagogue. If they sold a synagogue, they can only purchase an ark. If they sold an ark, they can only purchase wrappings for a Torah. If they sold wrappings, they can only buy scriptural books. If they sold those, they can only buy a Torah scroll with the proceeds. You cannot buy any of these with lesser sanctity by selling any of these, not even with leftover money. The Gemara says that some say a town square has no sanctity, so it can be sold for anything. We were discussing the ark of a small village. If it's from a large village, some say you can't sell that at all, as it's essentially public property. This is discussed, along with some quick points on the division of the land of Israel to the 12 tribes. There's further points on a synagogue, if you can disassemble and sell it to build a new one, if you can sell the bricks. Some specifically disallowed renting the old bricks for other purposes. Also, articles used for a mitzvah can be thrown out afterwards, things like a sukkah, a lulav, a shofar, and tzitzis. Some items themselves have sanctity and holiness and can't be thrown out. Things like tefillin, a mezuzah, a container for a Torah scroll, and tefillin covers and straps. Some hold a lectern falls into the latter category, as the Torah is sometimes placed directly on it, and the same by the curtains of the ark. Similarly, an old ark can be deconstructed to be rebuilt into a smaller ark, but not a lectern. In old ark's curtains can be reused as wrappings for a Torah scroll, but not for a scriptural book, like a chumash. There's more points on this and some laws of ritual impurity in a synagogue, if there's a corpse there for some reason, and how to remove it. Some say the wrapping cloths for a Torah scroll, when they're old, should be repurposed as burial shrouds. Some say an old, worn Torah scroll should be buried alongside a Torah scholar. All of this is discussed further, along with points on the proper manner of wrapping a scroll and text and similar. New Mishnah, a public synagogue may not be sold to an individual, as its level of holiness is then reduced. Others disagree, saying that then it should also be disallowed to sell a synagogue from a large city to a small city. The Gemara says that the response to that would be that there's still sanctity if it's by a smaller city, but not so by an individual. The answer to that would be, yeah, but there's still a clear reduction of sanctity, as the verse says, with the multitude of people is the glory of the king. New Mishnah, townspeople can sell a synagogue on condition that if they want, it could be returned back to them. Others say that they can sell it permanently, besides for it being used as a bathhouse, tannery, mikveh, or laundromat. Some say it could be sold to be used as a courtyard, and then the buyer could do whatever he wants with it. The Gemara says this point that you should sell a synagogue with the stipulation that it should be returned if you want, that's problematic, as if they use it in between, they're benefiting off of it. So it's essentially interest, which is not allowed. So we say that this is like the rule that interest is allowed if it's only in one aspect. This is discussed further, along with points as to how far away from a place of prayer you need to be while using the restroom. It also talks about the importance of making Kiddush, the blessing over a cup of wine, in a proper manner, and other good traits. There are further proper actions and traits listed that different sages said resulted in them having a long life. Things like giving charity, not showing anger, wearing tefillin, not looking at a wicked person, and others. New Mishnah. A synagogue that fell into ruin still has its sanctity, so you can't eulogize someone in it. Do labor like twisting ropes or spreading nets in it. You can't spread out fruits to dry on the roof, and you can't use it as a shortcut. A verse is brought as a source. If grass grows in a ruined synagogue, you shouldn't uproot it, so that way people will grieve. The Gemara clarifies these points and says that if the synagogue is desolate, you shouldn't take care of the synagogue to allow grass to grow. It also says not to make calculations in a synagogue, and the negative things that will occur if you do. It also says not to just walk into a synagogue to escape heat or rain, but if you need to call somebody out of the synagogue, when you enter, you should say a verse of Torah while inside, or at least ask a child within to tell you what verse he's learning, or at least just wait a while inside. There are further points on eulogizing people and how these sages eulogize particular individuals. It also speaks on the great honor of learning Torah. This is spoken on further, and some specific synagogues that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, rested on. There are further points on the holy sanctity at synagogues, and not to use one as a shortcut, and some other laws of respect that apply to a cemetery. New Mishnah. Some points on readings from the Torah. There are 4 special readings done during the month of Adar. If the Rosh Chodesh, the first of the month, fell out on Shabbos, we read the portion of Shkalim. If it fell out during the week, we read that portion the prior Shabbos, with other caveats. And the next Shabbos, we read the portion of Zachor. The next Shabbos, we read the portion of the Para Adoma. The 4th Shabbos, we read the portion of HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. And the next Shabbos, we go back to normal. We also read a special portion on any holiday that falls out on the Shabbos, including Rosh Chodesh, Chanukah, Purim, fasts, Ma'amodos, as discussed in Tractate Megillah, and on Yom Kippur. All of these individual portions are discussed along with their proper procedure. Details on which parts to read of the Shkalim portion are brought, and the proper times, along with also the Zachor portion and the others. Basically, the different possible combinations of dates by readings are essentially as discussed, these 4, depending on how the calendar works out. The other points are also discussed. New Mishnah. On Passover, we read the portion of the festivals. On Shavuos, we read the 7 weeks portion. On Rosh Hashanah, on the 7th month, on the 1st of the month. On Yom Kippur, after the death, on the 1st of Sukkot, the festival portion. The rest of the days, the portion on the festival offerings. On Chanukah, the portion of the offerings of the 10 tribes' princes to the tabernacle. On Purim, we read, and Amalek came. On Rosh Chodesh, and on your new moons. On Ma'amodes, we read about the creation. On fast days, the portion on blessings and curses. We don't interrupt that in the middle, and one person reads all of them. Mondays, Thursdays, and the preceding Shabbos afternoon, you read the regular Torah portion of the week, and then again on Shabbos. The source for all of this is, and Moshe proclaimed the festivals of God to the children of Israel, which means to read their portion at their proper time. The Gemara clarifies what to do on 2-day holidays. If you want to know the final result of every single one of the many Torah portions read, it should be in a standard prayer book. It also goes through the Haftorahs. The formatting for all of these are discussed. It also goes briefly through how to say the blessings, how to close the Torah scroll with positioning the seam in the middle, and to roll it out from the outer scroll and close it by tightening it from the inner roll. There are further points on this. The Torah should be read with the proper cantillation notes, or else you'll be buried bare of that mitzvah, and further points on the proper rolling of the wrappings of the Torah scroll. In addition to reading the portion on a holiday, Moshe decreed that you should study their laws too. The laws of Passover on Passover, the laws of Shavuos on Shavuos, and the laws of Sukkot on Sukkot. And with that, that's the end of chapter 4 and the entire Tractate Megillah. Alright, that was a lot of information, so here's a rough summary of a lot of the practical takeaways from the tractate. There are 4 central obligations on the holiday of Purim. The holiday of Purim commemorates the story of the Book of Esther, wherein the wicked Haman sought to use his political power to destroy the Jewish people, and the righteous Mordechai and the Queen Esther foiled his plot with God's help. The Megillah, the scroll containing the Book of Esther, is read on this holiday on the 14th of the month of Adar, although in some particular cities it's read on the 15th. The other obligations on this holiday are to give charity to the poor, to have a celebratory feast, and to give gifts of food to friends. There are specific Torah portions read on specific dates. The Torah, when read, is split into portions, with different people being called up, wherein they say a blessing before and after the reading. On holidays, fast days, and certain specific Shabbosim throughout the year, there are select Torah portions read from, in addition to the regular weekly Torah portion. Certain holy items have levels of sanctity and must be treated with respect. Things like a Torah scroll, tefillin, books of scripture, synagogues, and similar are considered holy and should not be sold to purchase something of lesser sanctity, among other laws. And that's about everything. Thank you so much for watching.